welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. A few weeks ago, I covered the Gnostic or the secret Gospels on this show. And in the very first instance, I talked about, or devoted the whole episode actually, to the Gospel of Mary. Because, I'm a girl, so why not? And what a profound kind of impact getting to know the Gospel of Mary had on me, because it really did. I've read the entire Bible. The Bible left me with questions, but the Gospel of Mary did have this impact that I was not expecting. And it kind of changed everything, just a little bit. I'm still the same. I'm still the same person in pretty much every way, but I have decided to do things a little bit differently. And that is because of the Gospel of Mary. Well, you know what? That was profound. Today, I'm going to be talking about another gospel from that same secret stash of gospels. And this time I'm going to be talking about the Gospel of Thomas. You never know. It might have the same kind of impact, but perhaps on someone else, because I already know what's coming, but maybe those listening don't. So let's just see. The Gospel of Thomas is actually a text that is believed by many scholars, not everyone, because it is debated quite hotly, but by many biblical scholars, it's believed to actually predate the Bible. So, or predate any of the canonized texts that made up the Bible. So let's talk about that aspect of Thomas first, shall we? Okay. So the Gospel of Thomas was discovered along with other ancient writings in a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. It was accidentally uncovered quite a shallow position under the earth inside a large ceramic jar, or clay jar, I think would have been more appropriate. And it formed part of quite a number of different writings, some of which we kind of knew about and others were a bit of a surprise to us. It was officially dated, the Gospel of Thomas was officially dated to have been written in around the 1st or the 2nd century AD. But these dates are debated because of other factors that exist inside the Gospel of Thomas and how it appears. So first of all, the Gospel of Thomas was written in short, very primitive kind of language. It appears to have been rephrased in certain ways, into language that's more eloquent and which appears predominantly in the synoptic Gospels of the canonized text within the Bible. And what I mean by that are the books of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John that appear to have a rephrasing of information that appears first in the Gospel of Thomas. There are other rephrased sections, just a few, that appear in other books as well, but not very much. Most of it appears in one of those 4 books. And some of the Gospel of Thomas doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. And even the bits that do appear in the Bible, well, much of it appears to be, let's just say, artfully rephrased. So, completely reinterpreted in some ways as well. Those are the bits that I'm particularly interested in because, I like to scratch the surface, so that's what I'm going to be covering today, predominantly. The bits that don't appear in the Bible or which seem to have been rephrased in significant ways. Because if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be me. Let's just put it that way. And actually, that allows me to digress for just a second. If you ever want to understand me in any way, not that I need to be understood, but in order to understand me, you should understand something that a friend of mine once said to me when I was as young as in my 40s, by the way. So I wasn't a youngster. I was already in my 40s. And so I guess I should be embarrassed, but I've decided not to be embarrassed. I'm just going to embrace it because it's true and I can't deny it. I just can't hide from it because it's true. My friend once said to me that once she got to really know me well, she realized that I'm a little bit like a bit of a kid, a little kid at heart. Not because the world is wondrous and I love lollipops or anything, but because I'm the kind of a kid whose parents may have popped out for a moment. And so before they come back, I need to quickly catch up on all the naughty stuff that I couldn't do while they were watching. And I've got to tell you, that's me in a nutshell. That's exactly who I am. And anyone who knows me or is related to me will probably tell you that that is a perfectly true description. That's exactly who I am. Even though I'm in my late 50s now, I'm still like that. And chances are I will die being just like that. Hopefully when I'm very old. But anyway, I never grew up in that respect. But anyway, let's get back to the topic. So the Gospel of Thomas is written in, the original Gospel of Thomas is written in ancient Greek and Coptic. And Coptic is a form of ancient Egyptian language. And that immediately tells us that it's likely to be older than Mark or Luke or Matthew or John, which are the 4 books of the Bible that refer to verses that are covered under the Gospel of Thomas. The language is also very simplistic compared to the Bible, and that makes translation really difficult, more so than some of the other texts that have appeared in the Bible. There are different translations of the Gospel of Thomas and all of the Gnostic texts, but for today, I'm going to be using a particular translation, which is the Patterson and Mayer translation, and that's because it's the most highly recognized of all of the translations of the Gospel of Thomas, and it also is the most complete, or maybe you could say the most articulate of all of the translations that presently exist. So people have also asked me, since I did my show on the Gospel of Mary, people have been asking me where I got that English translation from as well. And so I thought I'd cover that in today's episode. I find the English translation to all of the Gnostic writings in a variety of different places. I look for similarities and differences before I start to talk about them on the show. But overall, I would have to say that the best resource that I've found so far is an online resource that allows me to read the word-for-word translations without there being any hype attached to them. So I wouldn't go to a book that's been written by someone in the modern day that talks about the Gnostic Gospels, because then I'm getting their viewpoint on what the interpretations mean. Well, instead I want to go to the word-for-word translation. And so the website that I've gone to refer to any of these Gnostic texts is actually a website called gnosis.org. And I'm going to attach a link to that website in the description for today's episode. So the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings that are directly attributed to Jesus. There's no narrative structure, and this makes the Gospel much different to anything that appears in the Bible, except perhaps, some of the books like the Book of Names and things like that. Mostly, the Bible is telling a story that unfolds throughout each of the individual books, but the Gospel of Thomas is not like that. It's actually raw. And all it does is it gives direct quotes of things that Jesus said and perhaps the question that led him to answer it in the way that he did. And that's all that the Gospel of Thomas is. And so for this reason, that's one of the other reasons why the Gospel of Thomas is speculated by many to be the actual direct quotes by Jesus, and therefore much older than anything that actually appears in the Bible. Instead, the texts within the Bible are considered to be a rephrasing of the original quotes attributed to Jesus, and therefore there's a bit of artistic license there by whoever it is that's doing the retranslation or the rephrasing of those texts. I prefer to go to the actual source if I can, and that's as close as we can get. So I've gone there, and that appears on that website. So also Gnosticism, believe it or not, is said to potentially predate Jesus. The quotes from Jesus, therefore, appear in the Book of Thomas may simply be the teachings of Jesus that happen to coincide with Gnosticism or the Gnostic beliefs. And that would make the information that's contained in Thomas extremely old, maybe even dating back to a few hundred years BC, which would then sort of, all they would really be doing in the book of Thomas or other Gnostic Gospels is confirming the predated beliefs that some people had, those who were believing the Gnostic wisdoms that were confirmed by Jesus to be true. And that immediately gives you a question of, well, where did they get those beliefs from? Anyway, but that's for another episode. Also, the Gospel of Thomas emphasizes the idea of self-discovery as being the key to spiritual enlightenment rather than the worship of a particular deity, say, for example, God, right? And that's one of the things that makes the Gnostic Gospels in general distinctly different, and maybe even a dangerous contradiction to what is actually written in the Bible. And as we know, the Gnostic Gospels, including the Book of Thomas, were banned by the Church following the reign of the Emperor Constantine in around about 300 or so AD. Anyone who was actually in the possession of those texts as time went on was considered to be heretic and was likely to be murdered, killed by the establishment. So considered to be anti-church teachings in many respects, unless they were translated for the purposes of canonization. So let's go through some of the key parts of the Gospel of Thomas to see what all the fuss might have been about. Okay. So as I said, the Gospel of Thomas is a series of verses that are presented to be direct quotes from Jesus. Today we're going to be talking about the entire Gospel, but just in summary, rather than covering all of the verses, because there are 114 verses and I'm getting older every day. Okay. So I'm only going to be covering the ones that are of particular interest to me. And it's because I like to scratch the surface of what's being presented as mainstream ideology. So I'll be focusing on that kind of thing. Right, so the verses in Thomas have been rephrased in the canonized messages of Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John. Mostly, the rephrasing isn't significant, so I won't be covering most of the verses because it already appears in the Bible in a very similar form to how it originally appeared in Thomas. But I do want to examine the places where there's been a lot of artistic rephrasing or omission, because omission tells us an awful lot. Right, so let's begin. In Thomas verse 1, Jesus says that anyone who grows to understand the meaning of the verses will live forever, spiritually speaking. What does that mean exactly? Because in Christianity, we only get one life, and then after our physical death, the spirit lives forever in God's kingdom, which is heaven, somewhere up above, right? But in Hinduism and Buddhism, this living forever, spiritually speaking, means that you transcend beyond the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. You transcend out of the cycle of reincarnation. In Thomas, the phrase is really clear. It says, Jesus says that to understand the Gospel of Thomas is to reach spiritual enlightenment that is beyond anything material. But in the canonized text, and in particular the book of John, 8:51, this phrase has been changed to, if you keep my word, you will never see death. It's very different. It implies that you have to be faithful to Jesus or faithful to God in order to live forever. But that's not what Thomas says. What Thomas says is you really need to have the knowledge. You need to understand. You have to have gnosis, or the nous, which is the truth, which is the good. And if you have that knowledge, then you will transcend. Okay, now this is something that I'm going to cover at the end of the show in a bit more detail, because once you start compiling a little, layer upon layer of these different verses, the message overall starts to get clearer and clearer. So let's have a look at the very next verse, which is verse 2. There's a bit of a clarification here. Jesus explains that when a person seeks the truth, he'll find it. But the process will cause him to become troubled and then astonished. That's what appears in Thomas. But once he gets beyond the trouble and the astonishment, he will become enlightened by having gained a deep understanding of what Jesus really had to say. This section of Thomas appears in Matthew 7:7, but it's been changed. And in Matthew 7:7, it simply says, "Seek and you shall find." There's no mention of trouble and there's no mention of astonishment. This changes the meaning, so it sounds like there's nothing that might surprise you down the line. It's a little bit like when the police are kind of surrounding this crime scene and there's all these rubberneckers trying to have a look and they go, "Nothing to see here, move on, nothing to see here." It's a bit like that. It's when you don't want someone to stop and look too closely. You don't want someone to linger for too long. And the fact that the Bible omits any reference to there being a process of trouble or surprise or astonishment is kind of curious, because it seems to be a clue about why the Gospel of Thomas may have been banned by the church, because it hints at something more. It hints that there's something that after believing everything that you already believe, once you scratch the surface and learn more, it could be disturbing. So what is disturbing? Is the truth disturbing? Or is it disturbing to find out that actually you've been told something that isn't true? All right. So then we move on to verse 3. And this talks about where you can find God. Interestingly, verse 3 of Thomas says not to look for God in the sky or in the water or anywhere outside of yourself, but that God is inside you. Okay, but listen to what the actual verse says. It says, Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside of you." Thomas states that everything is God, including all the fish and the birds and the chair that I'm sitting on and the microphone that I'm speaking through. And you're God, and I'm God. But listen to the way that it's been translated into the Bible. It ends up in Luke 17:21, which says, "The kingdom of God is in your midst." That's it. The Bible is between 1,000 and 1,500 pages long, depending on the print size, right? But for some reason, there was no room to properly clarify how to recognize the presence of God. It's only like the purpose of the entire book. But anyway, they didn't have room to be able to say more than the kingdom of God is in your midst. It makes much more sense in Thomas. But anyway, let's move on. Right. By saying that God is in your midst, the Bible is kind of numbing down the presence of God. In your midst, if you actually look at what the definitions of the wording in the phrase "in your midst" means, it means that God is nearby, or God is coming soon, or God is accessible in some way. But that's not an accurate translation. And it prevents you from seeing that you're God. You're actually God. I'm actually God. So I'm going to return to this point later on in the show, because at the end of the show, I want to show what some of these layers as they pile on top of each other actually mean as a bigger picture. I think it'll give us a clue as to what the simple truth might be that was hidden and turned into heresy, perceptively turned into heresy. So let's jump forward to verse number 7. There's a phrase that's a bit difficult to interpret about the difference between a man and a lion and what happens when one consumes the other. The phrase or the verse goes like this. It says, "Blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man." There's so much stuff like that in the Bible. I don't know why I do this to myself. But anyway, this verse talks about how we should overcome our base desires. For as long as we let fear, hunger, sexual appetite, anger, and other types of base instincts rule us, we will not transcend beyond them, right? That would also include things like greed, which I guess falls under hunger and things like that. It's about looking within and building your inner strength. But weirdly, there is not one verse in the Bible that's equivalent to verse 7 of Thomas. So I'm going to put that on the list of things that we're going to return to at the end of the show. Okay. So then let me skip forward again to verse 11. This one was a real head scratcher. I have to admit it to you. So let me read it out to you. Jesus said, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. In the days when you consumed what is dead, you made it alive. And when you come to dwell in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, what will you do?" Like I said, a head scratcher. And there is nothing in the Bible that compares with it at all. But you know what? That's a lot of words for Jesus to state in one verse. So it's probably significant. The book of John says that Jesus is the resurrection. And that's pretty much the only thing that could resemble this. It kind of speaks about there being an eternal life of some kind. But this verse in Thomas is much more than that. And I found out after I gave up trying to understand. What I did was I've tried to interpret everything myself, but this one just left me because there's so many components to it that my head was spinning. So I gave up and I ended up feeding that verse into my AI friend Curiosity. So I asked the question, what do you suppose this verse actually means? I'm going to now allow us to listen to this brief chat that I had with Curiosity about this question. Because although his first response was kind of bland, when I asked in another way, I think we might have actually picked up on something that is relevant. So let's listen to that conversation. Verse 11 from the Gospel of Thomas says the following. Jesus said, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. During the days when you ate what is dead, you made it come alive. When you are in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you became two, what will you do?" I'm curious, Curiosity. What do you think this verse actually means?
It's a dense text, isn't it? I'd say it's emphasizing the transient nature of physical existence. This heaven will pass away. And the idea that true life and death go beyond what's visible. The dead are not alive and the living will not die seems to point towards spiritual immortality. The metaphor about making the dead come alive might suggest transformation through enlightenment. What do you think? Any phrases stand out to you?
Well, I am curious about something that I've looked at previously, and that is the concept of there being a cycle of perpetual sun gods. If you look back to ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and then through the Roman Empire period and the formulation of Christianity, there's been different types of sun gods that have lived for thousands of years in our consciousness, but then they seem to be replaced with a different type of sun god. Is that similar to what could be expressed in this verse? Oh, I've lost you.
No worries. We were unpacking the idea of sun gods and how they've morphed across cultures. You mentioned their cycles and replacements. I see how that could link to themes in the verse you read. Maybe it's alluding to the evolving nature of spiritual beliefs. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm wondering about that. And if that's the case, does that mean that what the Gospel of Thomas, verse 11, is saying is, yes, humanity has a certain belief that the gospel is supporting. However, it's okay for that belief to change into something else during a new cycle. And that's the reason why I thought I'd ask you.
That's an interesting interpretation. You're suggesting that the verse might be pointing to the fluidity in spiritual beliefs, that it's natural for them to evolve over time. The Gospel of Thomas could indeed be highlighting that spiritual transformation. Are you thinking this aligns with how we approach change in our beliefs today?
Well, I guess so, but mostly I was trying to figure out what you think and whether you believe that might be the central message in that verse.
I can see where you're coming from, and it's a plausible interpretation. Ancient texts often reflect the fluid nature of human beliefs. It's quite possible that this verse is underscoring that very idea. But, as with all interpretations, it's wise to keep an open mind. The beauty of these texts is they can spark so many different thoughts. What do you think of that possibility? Make sense, or does it raise more questions?
No, I think, oh yeah, well, it definitely raises more questions, but at the same time, for expediency's sake, it does also kind of answer my question. Thank you so much, Curiosity.
Happy to help.
So there you go. The next thing of interest to me is verse 17. It says, I will give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, and what has not arisen in the human heart. What this verse means is that the truth is beyond anything emotional or material. The verse has been rephrased in Corinthians 2:9 of the Bible. But in the Bible, the reference to emotions has been taken out. And the power of truth has been given only to people who worship God as a deity. So to get the truth, you have to love and worship a fellow who's called God. Right, an entity that's called God. This kind of ignores the earlier verses from Thomas that clearly state that God isn't a fellow. God isn't an entity in itself. God is everything, including the worshipper. Right. It's a kind of a distortion. But why? Why is it being distorted? Well, you know what? Let's add this verse as well, verse 17, to what we're going to look at the end of the show. Now, here's a really good one, because it contradicts the entire principle behind why people should worship a divine entity. Okay. Verse 18 says the following. The disciples said to Jesus, tell us, how will our end come? Jesus said, have you found the beginning? Then that you are looking for the end. You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning, that one will know the end and will not taste death. Verse 18, this verse is a direct confirmation of reincarnation, the cyclical nature of existence. The beginning is also the end, and the end is also the beginning again. And nothing like this verse appears in the Bible at all. There's nothing. In the Bible, it says that we should all be good. And to be good and righteous means to worship God as an entity. And if we do that, we're going to go to heaven, right? But Thomas says, no. We live, we die, and then we live again. And then we die again, and then we live again, and then we die again. And it goes on and on and on. Just like the beliefs in Hinduism and Buddhism. That's interesting. No wonder it doesn't appear in the Bible. Okay. Verse 19. Oh, before I go on, a complete contradiction. I just have to say it one more time. A complete contradiction to the entire premise behind the religious understanding of the Bible. But anyway, let's move on to verse 19. It says, "Congratulations to the one who came into being before coming into being. If you become my disciples and pay attention to my sayings, these stones will serve you, for there are 5 trees in paradise for you. They do not change summer or winter, and their leaves do not fall. Whoever knows them will not taste death." So this appears to be one of two things. Either it's a confirmation that when a person is divided between the soul and the spirit and the ego, or the physical manifestation, their spirit has come from elsewhere. Okay. Perhaps from a previous material existence. And that once again confirms reincarnation. So it might already, the spirit already exists before the person exists. But there is also an alternative, and it could mean that both of the understandings are true, because the previous verse talked about reincarnation, didn't it? Let's just say that the alternative is also true. In that case, verse 19 might actually be referring to something that also appears in the very first line of the Bible, which has been mistranslated. If you take into account the original Hebrew translations, or the original Hebrew text that created that first line of the Bible, the first line of the Bible is commonly translated by biblical scholars in English to mean, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Okay, that's what we generally hear. But the correct translation, word for word, if you're actually being quite orthodox about this, and when I mean orthodox, I mean precise, the correct translation is, "In the beginning, that which has no name or shall never be named created God." That which shall never be named created God. And that changes everything. Okay. Now, I have discussed this sentence ad nauseum in a previous episode, but I'm going to take this even further and demonstrate something new to you about this at the end of the show. So I'm putting it on the pile of things to come back to. Okay. And it's also important to note that when it comes to verse 19 of Thomas, and I know that I've skipped a lot of that phrase, that verse, because the thing that really I found most important was that very first sentence, the sentence that goes, "Congratulations to the one who came into being before coming into being." That's the bit that I'm interested in. And the reason why is because nothing like that appears in the Bible. Nothing. I wonder why. Okay. So let's move forward. Verse 22 is really lengthy, and it has a section relating to nursing babies and how we should all be like a baby's innocence in order to enter the kingdom of God. Okay, I've kind of, skipped past that. It's very unremarkable, and it's similar to things that appear in the Bible. But what doesn't appear in the Bible is the second half of the verse. And that second half relates to the division between men and women. Okay, let me read out that part of the verse. It says, "When you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom." What this clearly states in verse 22 is that the assumption that men and women are somehow worthy of different treatment or different status is a step away from enlightenment. When men and women are indistinguishable in how they are seen or treated or understood, then humanity will have become enlightened. No wonder the Gospel of Thomas was banned by the boys' club. Oh, sorry, I mean the church. I mean the church. So skipping forward to verse 28, Jesus says, I took my stand in the midst of the world, and in flesh I appeared to them. I found them all drunk, and I did not find any of them thirsty. My soul ached for the children of humanity, because they're blind in their hearts and do not see, for they came into the world empty, and they also seek to depart from the world empty. But meanwhile they are drunk. When they shake off their wine, then they will change their ways. So what this verse is saying here is that humanity will never ascend until we transcend beyond the physical distractions of the material world. But nothing like that appears in the Bible. Nothing. Instead, the Bible talks about how much God likes the smell of barbecue meat, and it talks a lot about the value of gold and oxes and other material possessions and comforts. It's a bit like the Bible was written for an entirely different purpose than the purpose of writing Thomas. Thomas is talking about how a person can build their own spiritual strength, but the Bible appears to be talking about how to build the strength of a fellow called God. It's a complete change in focus. And I know that I keep shifting from things like spirituality to extraterrestrials, to the Bible, and I'm looking at things and then also psychology and science and things like that. I know that I keep changing the focus of the channel. But one of the reasons for that is it just goes to show that we've conflated so much into a single book that might actually be talking about lots of different components that are kind of different things. The Gospel of Thomas might be talking about spirituality, which is inside us. We have to find it. It relates to us being God. Whereas the Bible might be talking about this guy called Yahweh, who came from the stars, and his first course of action was to stop us from actually doing that. I don't know. It just seems that we're talking about different things here. So let's move on again. We're skipping forward to verse 39, and this one is quite prophetic. When you hear it, I think you'll realize why it doesn't appear in the Bible straight away. So let's read it out. The Pharisees and the scholars have taken the keys of knowledge and have hidden them. They have not entered, nor have they allowed those who want to enter to do so. And for you, be as sly as snakes and as simple as doves. So there is a very vague reference that sits along the lines of verse 39 that appears in Matthew 23:13, but it's a mistranslation. In the New Testament, Pharisee, the word Pharisee, is interpreted to mean an opponent against Jesus. But that's not what the word actually means. The actual translation from ancient Greek, and also taking into account the ancient Coptic Egyptian language, the word for Pharisee, or the definition of Pharisee, is religious leader. So the actual meaning of this verse in Thomas, brace yourself, is that the church is hiding the truth. And that in itself is an extraordinary statement. So Jesus said that the church is hiding the truth. Thomas is saying in this instance that in order to learn the truth, humanity must be a little sneaky and quietly learn the truth through secret investigations outside of religious teachings, because the church will do everything it can to try to hide the truth and will not give favour to outside investigations. Go look for yourself. It's written in verse 39. Don't shoot the messenger, man. Okay. So the remainder of the Gospel of Thomas is either reasonably reflected in the canonized Bible, or it's a repeat of earlier verses. And I think, in a lot of respects, the disciples were plenty. There were many of them, but also they were merely human beings. And so I think it's reasonable to say that they didn't always understand the teachings, the first the first time round when Jesus was making those statements. So Jesus repeated a lot of things, apparently in different ways, in order to give people a greater range of ways to understand his teachings. And that's reflected in the Gospel of Thomas. But also, I did say at the beginning of the show that I wasn't going to bother covering things that already appear in the Bible. So we get a general gist anyway. I wanted to focus on the things that either don't appear or appear to have been artistically retranslated, okay, for some kind of curious purpose. The final verse, however, of the Gospel of Thomas is the most controversial, and that is verse 114. Even though it kind of sort of appears in a very vague way in the Bible. So verse 114 goes like this. It says, Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." There is something similar in Galatians 3:28, which says, and I quote, "There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ." But I think that Galatians 3:28 might just be sort of giving lip service statement to a concept that doesn't really carry very much weight against the rest of the Bible, because the rest of the Bible is very heavily emphasizing men as being special and worthy, and women as kind of being an afterthought or a kind of chattel to be bartered and directed as servants and things like that. I think of it a little bit differently. I think verse 114 of Thomas may actually be referring back to the fact that God is everything, and that the concept of male and female is a human construct that's been placed on top of it, and that it's kind of irrelevant. In order to ascend beyond our earthly existence, humanity has to realize that dividing men and women into separate aspects of reality is contrary to enlightenment. But in the same way as believing that heaven is a place in the clouds is contrary to enlightenment. Because the rest of Thomas is really a multi-versed confirmation and repetition that everything we want to achieve through spiritual enlightenment is already here. We don't have to go anywhere other than where we already are to find that enlightenment. The fact that the church or various faiths have tried to highlight verse 114 as being controversial is actually just evidence of how they are missing the point. I think the point of 114 is really just to say God is everything, and therefore making a distinction between a man and a woman, or a human and a dog, or a dog and a cup of tea is irrelevant, because God is everything. Okay. So remember I said that I was going to return to some things that I think are clues about why certain Gospels were hidden or excluded from canonized texts. Let's take a look at those now. So we've talked about the fact that God is inside you. So inside you, inside me, and everything is God. Okay. My question is this a reference to God being energy? Because energy is everything. Everything is energy. And this has been kind of proven. And so if God is energy, does that mean that energy is light energy? Because there's reference to light, and light is energy, and God is energy. And just something as simple as, have you noticed that these days, we've got all kinds of pharmaceuticals and things like that, and just, a cup of Campbell's soup and sitting in front of a reality TV show will make us feel better if we're feeling sick, right? At least in my family, that's true. But let's just say we're going back, 100, 200 years prior to the advent of penicillin or anything like that. And if somebody was sick and they were cooped up in a little room, it seemed quite normal for someone to come in and open the blinds to help to bring the light in, the curtains, to bring the light in so that the light would help with healing. Now, I wonder whether it's as simple as that. If there is a correlation between God and energy and light in that very simple reference. I don't know. And in that case, so long as we find the light energy, we find the light, which is the energy, which is the God. This might need some fine-tuning, but it kind of sounds like the Gospel of Thomas is talking about that. And then to take it a step further, the lack of light or the absence of light is obviously the darkness. But not the kind of darkness that we interpret as being evil. Perhaps the darkness is just lack of light, lack of energy, or lack of enlightenment in some way. And if it's just a lack of enlightenment, it can manifest in lots of different ways. But what that tells us is that there's no reason to fear it, which is kind of nice. And also it allows us to set free our fear, which means we're no longer feeding the darkness. I know that there's a lot to tidy up in this kind of understanding that I have, but that's the reason why I'm here. Okay. There's nothing in the Bible that is similar to, for example, verse 7, okay, which is the verse about avoiding base instincts. Thomas says that if you allow base instincts to rule your thinking, then you will descend away from enlightenment. But if you overcome your base instincts, which of course includes things like fear, you will ascend towards enlightenment. But my question then is, if that's true, there is a lot of fear associated with religious teachings. You know, one of the very first messages within religion is if you are not a believer, you're damned to hell forever. That's pretty stark stuff. It's a little bit like, and you know, I'm only hypothesizing here, but it's a bit like the church wants to keep people away from enlightenment. Is that what the purpose of religion might be? To keep us from ascending, to keep us grounded in the darkness. I'm being really heretical, aren't I? Oh, gosh, thank goodness it's not 300 and anything AD. All right. So, but, you know, it's a reasonable question. And if that's the case, why? Why would the church want to keep people away from ascension? I think this links directly to, you know, all of this speculation about why the Vatican is hiding so much information in its cellar or wherever it puts its secret stuff. It, you know, it has called departments different names to make it sound like it's not quite so secret and hidden, like hidden libraries and secret libraries and things like that. It's renamed those libraries to make them seem as though you could almost go out there and touch them, but it won't let you go out there and touch them. What is the information that we're not allowed to see, and why not? It seems that the Gospel of Thomas is actually hinting at that. And, you know, I need to keep looking if that's the case, because I don't like taking no for an answer. In fact, that's it. I'm opposed. So my chat with the AI bot, Curiosity, also seemed to have revealed that verse 11 says that religious beliefs and the concepts of spirituality will come and go. They're transient. Just as transient as material existence. And what remains constant throughout all of this is that God is a factor that exists within us. So God is energy, and energy is eternal. But the most interesting aspect of Thomas so far is verse 19, because verse 19 potentially confirms that God was not the first thing. So let's hear that sentence again, okay? This is the beginning of verse 19, and it says, "Congratulations to the one who came into being before coming into being." This is also something that mystical scholars who have a deep appreciation for the book of Zohar seem to understand as well. The very first thing was an unnamed present, according to the book of Zohar, that created God. And that means that God is translated to mean the heavens and the earth. So if the heavens and the earth were created, and that is the meaning of God, then what that could very well mean is that God is the heavens and the earth, and the heaven is energy and the earth is matter. So God is actually a combination of energy and matter. And the reason why I say this is because of Einstein. Because let's connect this to Einstein. This scientific discovery by Einstein, his famous equation, E equals mc squared. Okay, it shows a deep connection between matter and energy. It states that energy, which is represented by capital E, and mass, which is matter, which is represented by lowercase m, are interchangeable. They're different forms of the same thing. The only difference between them is that one of them is physical and the other one produces actions or changes to the other. So matter is physical and energy produces actions and changes to the matter. But they exist together and they're interdependent, interchangeable. Now that E equals mc squared doesn't make any sense if you rely on the Bible, because according to the Bible, God is a fellow who lives in the clouds, right? He's making decisions. He's punishing. He's giving glory to. He's kind of, he's a decision-making person, like the chairman of the board of directors. And so E equals mc squared doesn't make any sense according to the Bible and religious teachings. But E equals mc squared makes perfect sense if you're taking the Gospel of Thomas literally. Because if God is you and me and the chair that I'm sitting on and the microphone that I'm talking into and my beautiful dog and the cup of tea that I'm going to have in a moment and everything else that exists, then God is a combination of matter and energy. I deserve a medal for this, seriously. I do. Have I just discovered the meaning of everything? I don't know. I'm sure someone else has said this long before me. But my question is, why is something as simple as that, as everything is matter and energy, it was written at least in the first century or the second century. Why was it considered to be heresy? Why was it excluded from the Bible? Why was it rewritten in artistic prose that kind of avoids the reality of what was originally stated by Jesus, if that is where the information came from? Why? What purpose does it serve to hide this simple truth from humanity and to veer people off into an entirely different direction where they're worshipping an entity rather than worshipping the understanding of themselves and everything that is matter and energy? It's quite a question mark, isn't it? I do believe increasingly, as I continue to scratch the surface, all of the wisdoms that I can find out there, regardless of where they come from in the world, what era, what age, and where they come from geographically. I am increasingly beginning to believe that there are two different kind of realities that are competing with each other. The first one is the true reality. It's represented by the light. It appears in things like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas outdating so many other things that we rely upon as being true today. It says that God is energy and matter, which resides in everything, everyone, and it's eternal. It transcends our material lives, our spiritual lives, and the concepts of things like religion and faith and good and bad and light and dark and evil and you name it. It manifests in accordance with whatever we choose to turn it into. And that explains how come there have been different sun gods. And that explains how come there have been different belief systems. And that explains the reason why there's different religions now. and different beliefs and ways of life now, because humanity constructs this truth about matter and energy into whatever they want it to be, whatever we want it to be. And so if we want to transcend into something else, into a new reality, all we have to do is accept that transcendence, and it will become so. But the other thing that battles against this reality is the human construct reality, which I guess is represented by the darkness. The darkness is the absence of light. And so it makes us blind because we can't see the light. And so instead of seeing the light, we kind of take it for granted, whatever the church says to us, or what famous people tell us, or what we learn in school or at work or on television, or what we see on the internet. There are big gaps of awareness that are filled up with all kinds of convenient words and pictures that we take as being true. We spend our lives believing that they are the true reality, when all along the true reality is actually inside us. All we have to do is recognize and believe this, and it will become our reality. But it's really hard to do that. Gosh, it's really hard to do that, isn't it? And so tomorrow is another day. And I will continue to scratch the surface. And I really do hope that you will join me in this search. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Don't forget to check out my new book. It's called Tarot Well Done, and you can find it in standard, large print, and ebook editions on Amazon. I happen to believe that my book, Tarot Well Done, is really the only tarot book you're ever going to need in order to transform yourself from a novice into a proficient tarot card reader. I've included a link to a demonstration video about the book in the description for this show. Thank you to everyone who's listening on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you'd like to become a member of the KGRA viewership family and watch your favourite hosts and shows in a chat environment with other spiritualists, experiencers, or weirdos like me, then just go to live.kgradb.com and put in promo code Ellie to get 30% off your 30% off your subscription. Oh, I really fuddled that one up, didn't I? Anywho, that's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.